Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the opportunity to contribute to this very interesting and vital debate on a massive issue affecting communities across our nation. It's always a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Strangford to give a particularly passionate and insightful contribution about the impact that the programme of closures will have on his community and his constituency. And of course I congratulate my honourable friend, the Member for Stoke-on-Trent North, for securing this debate and speaking so passionately and knowledgeably on the issue and introducing the debate to the House this afternoon. And also the Honourable Member for Hazelgrove for his contribution in securing the debate through the Backbench Business Committee. I speak with a degree of nostalgia and affection for community banking, given that I've grown up around community banks, given my mum's worked in retail banking her whole career. So I remember vividly as a kid being taken down into the vaults of the bank in the Bank of Scotland in Charing Cross, where my mum worked, and opening my Squirrel Saver account with the Bank of Scotland and my little plastic Bank of Scotland branch piggy bank that I had, which was great. So I speak with great affection about it, but I also know how important community banks are, particularly to elderly customers and particularly vulnerable people in the community, because they develop a very close and affectionate relationship with the staff who know them very well and know what their needs are and are able to accommodate them. And it's a form of personal interaction that builds a real affection and relationship and a long-term engagement with banks that is a hugely valuable asset for banks. And I hope that more banks would recognise how important that level of personal interaction and contribution is to communities. It's a very vital thing, and it's a shame to think that that bank I mentioned in Charing Cross is now Starbucks. So it just shows that this is a long-term process of withdrawal from communities, and it's something we really need to challenge because it's approaching a real cliff edge in our communities. And my worry is that the programme of bank closures, particularly in recent years, that we have observed appears to disproportionately target the poorest communities in our society. We've seen well over 1,000 branches close in the last 2 years alone. In my constituency of Glasgow North East, where unemployment is twice the national average, and I had actually the lowest turnout of any constituency in elections, which shows that perhaps the level of disengagement that many people have. We've seen RBS closures in Postle Park, which is one of the poorest communities, not only in Glasgow but also in Scotland. And we've also seen the closure of the RBS branch Alexandra Parade in Denniston in recent months. And that has also been followed by the closure of the Clydesdale Bank in Springburn. It was a cruel irony, I thought, when I went down to look at the Clydesdale Bank branch in Springburn Way, just next to the shopping centre, that I saw well in business and doing a roaring trade was the Bright House branch, which is a rapacious organisation that fleeces the poorest communities in our society by essentially, I would argue, mis-selling consumer goods at outrageous rates of interest, and it's something that we should challenge as part of that. There's more people forced out of normal commercial banking into the hands of these rapacious lenders have to be challenged, and that's something we're happy to give way on that particular point.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. He's talking about poorer communities being left behind by these changes in banking. He's absolutely right. And the recent stay of execution to 10 branches in Scotland, although welcome, it's rural areas and that is welcome. These are some of the wealthiest communities in Scotland. 3 of the banks being saved are in this Scottish Secretary of State's constituency. And the government's the majority shareholder of RBS. So surely there is a role for RBS to step in and look after these more deprived communities.
I thank my honourable friend for that contribution, and it's absolutely correct. It's one thing we don't actually see, but I've tried to piece together the evidence as much as I can. It's not something that's actually nationally recorded. What is the density of banking operations within the poorest communities in our society? That's not something, the data isn't even gathered on that issue. I've tried to piece that together. I certainly know that in Postle Park and Springburn, they fall into the most deprived decile of the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, and that includes them being in the bottom decile for employment, health, education and housing indicators. And that seems to be the case with a lot of branch closures, certainly in the Glasgow area, and I've pieced that together on a personal level. It would be interesting if the government could actually oblige banks to provide that data as a matter of national standards. Also, looking at that contrast in the wealthiest parts of the city, the example I looked at was Byres Road. Every major bank is represented in that area, the wealthiest, arguably, postcode in Glasgow. So it's an interesting contrast that banks seem to be withdrawing from the poorest communities whilst maintaining their services within the richest parts of Glasgow. And if that's extrapolated across the UK, it paints a very dismal picture indeed. It's been argued over the course of this debate that it's a reality of technological change. More people are going on to online banking, using online banking services, but the reality is 2 million Scots don't use online banking, and they are disproportionately older people who aren't familiar with that change in technology. We have to be realistic about the rate of change and the rate at which that transition is practical in order to reduce the harm caused to people in society and prevent that sort of generational dislocation that is evidently occurring. Over a third of people using Citizens Advice Scotland services, for example, have no or limited internet access. So think about how those people will access finance. How will they access banking if their local communities are being disinvested in by the major commercial banks? And I think these closures are not just driven by technological change. And I have great privilege to be a council member of the Institute of Engineers and Shipbuilders in Scotland. And of course the banking sector is a huge driver of innovation in our society. We've seen huge technological changes, as honourable members have mentioned. And one of the ones that sticks out to me as a great British innovation is of course the ATM, the auto teller machine. In 2016, it was actually a Scot, James Goodfellow, who was inducted into the Scottish Engineering Hall of Fame for his work in inventing and patenting the first ATM in 1966. But that was in response to the desire for the major commercial clearing banks to close on Saturday mornings. So they were trying to find a disruptive means of technology to accommodate that need to close banks on Saturday mornings, or desire to close banks on Saturday mornings, and that's where the ATM came into being, and that's why it's so ubiquitous in our high streets today. So we have to think about harnessing the technological change for the public good, and not simply using it as a cop-out, as an excuse to ridiculously disinvest from our communities at an inappropriate rate. And that is something we really need to challenge in this House. It's about adapting the technological change for the public good. It's not simply leaving the banks up to be judge and jury about the nature of which that should occur and how that should occur. And I think when I mentioned that closures are not just driven by technological change, they have to look at the reality of the banking sector. In the UK, 5 of the major commercial banks hold 85% of all current accounts in the UK. And if you combine the nature of the commercial banking in this country, where you combine personal banking services with riskier investment banking activities, that's all symptomatic of a very difficult sector to manage. It's a very high-risk sector that has threatened our national prosperity in the last decade alone with the banking crash. So the reality of the current banking system is, in this country, that it is an oligopoly, and it is one of the most centralised in the world. And as even Adam Smith mentioned, it is recognised that profit seeking behaviour is contrary to the common good and the creation of national wealth. And that's something we should always remember when we consider this issue. Look at, by contrast, in Germany, there are over 400 local savings banks known as the Sparkassen, 1,000 cooperative-run banks and 300 private commercial banks, in contrast to those 5 huge, massive banks in this country. And they are characterised by providing patient finance, and not just to households, but also critically to consumers, not just consumers, but industry. And look back at that innovation I mentioned about the ATM. When James Goodfellow made his speech in receiving that induction into the Engineering Hall of Fame, he said, "It's the greatest regret of my career that ATMs were invented in this country, yet they're not built or manufactured in this country. We have not benefited from the industrial innovation that happened in this country." And we look at this industrial strategy, it's symptomatic of our banking sector. We don't finance our industrial growth because we're seeking high-risk, high-return profits in the city. We're not looking at investing in the real economy, and that's the contrast to the German banking system that we see. Why is it Germany has the largest manufacturing sector in Europe, and indeed one of the largest in the world? Because they have a banking system that is resilient enough to underpin patient finance that allows real industrial growth and real long-term economic resilience. And that is what we see with investment in machinery and a productive economy, that their productivity rate, where German workers produce in 4 days what UK workers produce in 5. If we look at it as a broader symptom of our malaise in banking and industry, we have to grip it at all levels, and that's something we really need to address. And that's why I'm so proud to stand here as one of the 39 cooperative members of Parliament, the largest group ever of cooperative MPs in Parliament, and the third largest party group in this House. And the Cooperative Party has long recognised these structural problems in society, and that's why our party, the Cooperative Party, propose turning RBS into a mutual owned by its members and run in a not-for-profit manner in the public interest. That is clearly self-evident and vital now. We need that disruptive intervention in the sector. We also want to create a legislative mechanism to support the development of credit unions in the United Kingdom, perhaps based on the American Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, which I think it was mentioned previously. The key innovation that Act brought in America under the Carter administration was to combat discrimination and access to credit for low and moderate income communities. And when we reflect back on the nature of bank closures in the UK and the highly likely situation that they are disproportionately affecting the poorest communities, that was known in the United States as redlining, where banks actually essentially blacklisted communities that they weren't worthy of investment. And that's, I think will be worthy of making the accusation that's happening in this country today, albeit on an informal and opaque basis. And it's about time we shone a light on the reality of that economic dislocation that's happening to the poorest communities in our country. So legislating using that Community Reinvestment Act or something similarly inclined would combat that discrimination by providing access to credit for low and moderate income communities. It would apply a rating to the banks based on the density of the operation and community in poorer areas. It includes investment in credit unions as a CRA activity, meaning the credit union sector is worth billions of dollars in the United States and competes on an equal footing with commercial banks. Even look at Santander's operations in the United States in contrast to the UK. £11 billion 5-year commitment to support community benefits. An increase of 50% was announced in the US, but it does not extend to its American community reinvestment activity to the UK because there is no legislative or regulatory imperative to do so. So the picture today in the UK is one of perilous dislocation, of banks being withdrawn from our most vulnerable communities. It is the duty of this House and this Government to not simply capitulate to free market dogma, but to temper and control that market in the public interest. Thank you very much.